Hey kids, you know what tonight is, right? Well, it's not actually Halloween because I had to film this in time for Halloween, you know? But nonetheless, it is Halloween now, relatively speaking. So let's do a scary game. But first... does not compare to the regular Nog.
I'm not mad, I'm just bored, and everything I do is only because there's nothing much else for me to do, and that includes you, and that includes you. Mess around with you, mess around with you, mess around with you.
Ah, yes, the Silent Hill franchise. One of my favorites, so yeah, we got that out of the way. I'm not one of those people that talks about how much the franchise sucked after number 4 because they're all good. I should put this down, otherwise I'm just going to spill it if I keep talking with it in my hand. You know, I guess there's another major point we need to cover here is that I'm not a huge horror buff in general, and certainly not of survival horror. I mean, in the late 90s, early 2000s, I had played the big 3, which was Silent Hill, Resident Evil, Alone in the Dark, but I was never drawn to the games because of the fact that they were survival horror, or that they were scary. It was always something else. Like, Alone in the Dark was the first game I got into, specifically the second. It was because I was reading a walkthrough, and I was wondering, what the fuck is going on in this game? So I had to check it out myself. And fortunately, around the time they had released the entire trilogy, so it was pretty obvious. I played Alone in the Dark, my friends played Resident Evil. Obviously, we each took notice of the other games, and we were like, whoa! Alone in the Dark. This is like Resident Evil, man. And I was like, Resident Evil? This is a lot like Alone in the Dark, man. So, obviously, little interest exchange. Game in question was the director's cut with the demo of Resident Evil 2. And that is where my interest in Resident Evil really took off, because I wasn't intrigued with the original game, but I did play it while I was waiting for Resident Evil 2, because why not? But it was really the whole idea that you would be in a city overrun with zombies that caught me. I was thinking it was gonna be like some Dawn of the Dead shit, but alas, it was 1997, so my overambitious mind just simply led me to disappointment. Then I heard about Silent Hill, another game that featured monsters in a town, except this time it was explicitly stated that you'd be able to explore the entire town. So, yeah, that's why I got into a lot of survival horror, because you got to run around towns infested with monsters. I'm really big into exploration. The graphics of Silent Hill are ambitious. I'm pretty certain they didn't look that good for the time, especially compared to, like, Resident Evil 2, but they were far more ambitious. Resident Evil wasn't truly 3D because you had these fixed camera angles and everything was pre-rendered, but Silent Hill is a proper 3D game. The camera freely moves with you, generally speaking. Even when there are set camera angles, they're usually still mobile to some extent. And even if they're not, you've got your own self-view. Pretty neat function that allows you to see all the details of the world. Although you do have to unlock this ability, for whatever reason. So while the graphics aren't the most impressive, you do have to realize what they were working with here. Plus, it also has dynamic lighting, Some of the gameplay takes place in the daylight, and some of it at night where you only have a little flashlight to help you along. And without that flashlight, it's really dark. Sometimes I turn off the light just to see how dark it really is. Jesus Christ! In either case, there is a common element here. You may have noticed your visibility is somewhat on the limited side. During the daytime you have this fog, and at night you have, well, anything not covered by your flashlight. Now this exists for two reasons. The first is, admittedly, draw distance on the game wasn't that great. But on the other hand, it was discovered that, hey, we could also use this to enhance the tension. It didn't start off as a legitimate tension device, but it evolved into it. The game does also have proper full motion videos, which look a lot more impressive. There is something to be said about these graphics, though. They're somewhat cursed. Like, this game did not get along with my capture card, as you can kind of see in the recording. Well, maybe you can't, but on the RAW files, whenever I went to the menu or looked at the map, the game would speed up. Audio, though, is whoa. It is on a whole nother level than Resident Evil. I think you know this guy's name already, even if you can't necessarily pronounce it. Akira Yamaoka. I think that's how you pronounce it. I think. He did all the music, and boy is it a bit of a doozy. Far creepier than anything you heard in Resident Evil. Got a total industrial sound, although the soundtrack kind of stretches the definition of music. I mean, there are a few distinct tunes here and there, but a lot of the time it's really more of an ambience. There's a lot of ominous droning or some screeching. There's even one track that I actually wondered if my game was glitching. For most of the game, it's either just ambience, or if there is some semblance of music, it's usually a short loop. Proper songs are generally limited to cutscenes and such. Akira also handled all of the sound effects for the game, which aren't nearly as impressive as the music, but honestly, they don't have to be. They're still very good. The enemies have some unsettling vocalizations, but there is one element to address that overlaps a little bit with the gameplay is the radio. This thing serves the purpose of alerting you to nearby enemies. If an enemy is nearby, you get static. The volume of static will depend on how close they are to you, how many enemies there are, what direction they are. Now, there are two contradictory mindsets to have about the radio. On the one hand, you might think that since it alerts you of enemies you can't see, it kind of robs the game of suspense and surprise. But on the other hand, you might think that knowing that there's an enemy out there that you can't actually see makes the game more tense. It's entirely up to you how to feel on that, but I know what I personally feel is completely different. The radio kind of dominates the audio package of the game. I might even say it's kind of annoying. As you might expect, you will run into a lot of enemies over the course of this game. So you're going to be listening to that radio a lot. As it so happens, you can actually turn off the radio. And honestly, I prefer to do that. It's actually nice to not be constantly listening to static, but I also don't think the radio is even really necessary in the grand scheme of things. Enemies make plenty of noise as is, so you certainly don't need the radio to tell you that something's coming your way. It's a little bit harder. They don't make as much noise as your loud-ass radio does, but I would say that's an improvement. It makes you have to pay more attention. And that just leaves us with the voice acting, which, considering this is 1999, it's actually pretty decent. It's not especially great, but compared to Resident Evil, this is downright Shakespeare. It's definitely not as good as Konami's own Metal Gear Solid. With a few exceptions, it generally lacks empathy. There isn't a whole lot of emotion here. but it's also not wildly overacted either. Some of the voice acting is legitimately good, and some of it is legitimately bad. You know, some of the writing is pretty bad. There are some real stinkers here.
Huh. Radio. What's going on with that radio? Do you work here?
I'm Dr. Michael Kaufman. I work at this hospital.
Well, that was an unnecessarily verbose answer. Another acceptable answer would have been yes. And then there's also an issue that doesn't necessarily have to do with the voice acting, but conversations usually have the same rhythm, where there's these pauses in between sentences, oftentimes after each individual sentence. I guess it's just how the game loads. As for the story, oh boy. Alright, you are Harry Mason, and you're on vacation with your daughter to a town called Silent Hill, when suddenly things go awry. And when you finally wake up, your daughter is missing. The short version is, you're trying to find your daughter, in the middle of a town that is infested with monsters. The long version is a lot more complicated, and I'm not really in the business of giving out spoilers, but suffice it to say, every town has its secret. Some are just darker than others. Obviously, there's a reason why the town is as messed up as it is. I don't really know if I can say any more without dropping any major plot points. Story's on the vague side, though. Not a lot is really explained.
Path of the hermit concealed by flowers.
What?
So the gameplay of Silent Hill is, well, it's a survival horror. It's kind of a funny name, you think about it. I mean, survival horror? How is that a genre? I mean, you might as well have Space Marines fighting aliens as a genre. But, you know, that doesn't necessarily tell you what kind of a game it is. I mean, it could be a first-person shooter, it could be third-person, but survival horrors all play the same way. I mean, if there are any games that play like a survival horror that don't have at least a basic element of horror, I've never seen one. I guess the closest analogy I could think of would be like Shenmue. So yeah, if you don't know, apparently there's a rule that survival horrors have to play a certain way. It uses tank controls, which everyone seems to hate nowadays, and maybe they didn't like it back then, but honestly, when you have a game with dynamic camera angles such as this, it makes perfect sense, because otherwise the controls would be completely dependent on which way the camera is pointed. Granted, tank controls are not exactly the most free form of control methods. You know, you basically stand in place, rotate, your options are either to move forward or backwards, and you can turn left or right while doing so. But this game does feature the ability to sidestep, which gives you an extra dimension of movement. I'm not sure how often you're likely to use it. I barely used it. You've also got this backwards jump. The combat is a bit more robust than Resident Evil. You've got an auto lock-on, and Harry will actually aim directly at the monster, regardless of whether it's above or below you, and you will track it as it moves. And you're also not locked into place generally. You can move around while aiming at an enemy, with the exception of a few bulky weapons. Although Harry's not necessarily the best shot, an algorithm determines the odds of you actually hitting anything, based on distance, whether they're moving, how long you're aiming. When you deal enough damage to an enemy, they fall down and you can finish them off with a kick. But unfortunately, the game really insists on you kicking every enemy you meet, unless you want to waste the ammo. It gets old real fast. The enemies also have an awareness AI that is based on line of sight and hearing. Doesn't mean much during the day, but when it's dark out, you can turn off your flashlight and the enemies won't be able to see you, but they can still hear you. On the whole, the combat is a big improvement over Resident Evil, but it certainly isn't perfect. In particular, I don't know how you're supposed to dodge the final boss's lightning. And while we're on the subject of combat, let's just stick with it because, honestly, it's one of the biggest parts of the game. You'll run into a lot of enemies in this game. You can either fight them or run. Running is probably the smarter choice, especially if you're playing on harder difficulties. but you can fight if you have the means. There's a decent selection of enemies. While they're all definitely different from one another, generally speaking, there isn't a whole lot of difference in dealing with them. Okay, these guys can fly, but generally speaking, you're still going to be dealing with them in the same exact way. And this is how you are going to want to fight them off. Shoot them from a distance. While the game does feature melee combat, and there's actually far more melee weapons than Resident Evil, the fact of the matter is that the melee combat isn't very effective at all. Hard to use, but better than nothing. That sums it up. Melee weapons are your last resort. The melee weapons in this game are pretty pathetic. I don't know how you're supposed to effectively fight with these things. I've tried using the knife on the very first enemy, and I got my ass kicked. Simply put, they're just not worth using. It's definitely an advanced tactic, which is probably not a good thing when your weapon is supposed to be a last resort. There's also a few bosses in the game, and one of them even has a little trick. I don't know if you actually have to do it that way, but it's an option. Now, technically speaking, exploration is the main point of the game. It just so happens that, more often than not, you're going to run into monsters. But you're going to be doing a lot more than that. After all, the goal of the game is to find your daughter. And obviously, this being a game, you're generally not going to find her. Most of the time, you're either wandering around aimlessly or finding clues that'll point you to where she might be. Okay, to back it up a second, the game does give you plenty of hints as to where you should go, so you won't really be wandering around aimlessly. But there's a lot of goodies to find, because as it turns out, Silent Hill is a pretty big place. It may not be as big as Raccoon City, but you can explore a hell of a lot more of it, and you are rewarded for doing so. As I just said, you can find a lot of supplies tucked away in corners. There are a number of buildings that are completely optional to enter, like a random convenience store, and some of these locations are actually important to understanding more of the plot. And in fact, it'll even determine what ending you get. How you play the game determines the fate of several characters, and there are 4 different endings to get. Streets of Silent Hill are wide open and generally non-linear. Usually there is more than one way to get to where you're going, and crazily enough, even though this is only the PlayStation 1, this game may very well have the second most exploration of any Silent Hill game. The major buildings of the game have a ton of rooms you can go into, even if a lot of them are completely unnecessary, but it's nice to have them just for the realism. Unlike Resident Evil, you'll actually find some bathrooms. Granted, they're not as big as they look. There's a lot of rooms you can't enter.
Fucking half of these things are busted.
You've also got this very useful map, which marks useful things like where you've been, what doors are open, what doors are locked, what routes are blocked, major objects of interest. So okay, you know what a survival horror is yet? You move around with tank controls, fight monsters, pick up items, read files for backstory and clues. Although, that's not such a big thing in this game. Do a little bit of basic problem solving. As well as pick your brain on a few full-on puzzles. And in my opinion, I think they're really damn well done. I think they're just about right in terms of difficulty. I know back in the day, 1 or 2 of them stumped me, but even now, I remember how to solve them, even if I don't remember the actual solution, so I still have to work it out in my mind. There is one key thing I want to note, is that all the puzzles have their clues given within the game. You don't need any outside knowledge. Even if one uses astrology symbols that have absolutely no bearing on the puzzle itself, even though you might logically think they do, there are 3 difficulty settings in this game. The difficulty settings determine how many enemies spawn, or sometimes what type of enemies spawn, how much ammo you get from each pickup. They make you take more damage. And on the lower settings, you actually have some degree of automatic reloading, in that as long as you're not continuously using the weapon, it will reload. Kinda hard to explain. I do think the game was a little overly generous in this department. I don't think they needed to hold it back until hard. As for replay value, you have a New Game Plus, where you can unlock some additional weapons, as well as gain access to an additional humorous ending, although sadly they omit the opening. Alright, so that's the gameplay in a nutshell. It's good, not especially great, but oh man, does it deliver in the horror department, just like a survival horror should. If you thought Resident Evil was scary, you haven't seen anything yet. And this being 1999, you probably didn't. This game makes the Resident Evils and Alone in the Darks of the time look like a freaking picnic. What, you thought Resident Evil was pushing the boundaries of gore? Psh, the visuals are great in this game. Or horrific, depending on how you look at it. Oh, but the game delivers a lot more than that, and I'm not just talking in terms of blood and guts, because actually that's not even the main focus of the game. It's more cerebral, in your mind, psychological terror. Now, if you play the sequels, it's not quite as emphasized, but it's still there. And yeah, there's also a few jump scares. Come on, it's not a horror game without some. But it needs to be restated that back in 1999, no video games were this scary. And this was demonstrated right at the beginning of the game. It was so good that the movie adapted this part wholesale. I gotta give the game this. It is an impressive display of technical prowess. The world is wide open and seamless. And the game is almost always running smoothly. Loading screens are fast except when you're going to major areas. Saving the game is super fast. There are some regional differences. I believe the European versions replaced this enemy with another similar one. And the US version is also missing a file. Well, I've said this before, but Silent Hill is a modest start to the franchise, but at the same time, I would put this right around the middle of the entire franchise. It's surprisingly moderate. There's nothing in here I especially like compared to the sequels, but there's also nothing in here I think the game dropped the ball on, which is more than I can say for some of the sequels. Even if I like them, I still admit that they dropped the ball in certain areas. It's really frustrating. Every single sequel takes one step in the right direction and one step in the wrong. That puts the original game in an odd position where it's modest compared to its sequels, but at the same time it's a better balanced game than most of them. Which I guess kind of makes it a better game in a lot of respects. But regardless of its place in the franchise, Silent Hill is a classic. It was a real game changer for the time. It's also a bit of an antique, but it's definitely aged better than a lot of other classics. It remains one of the best survival horrors ever made. So therefore, I will award it an A+.
Yeah.
Yes, help you?
Yeah, how you doing? Who's in charge over there?
What can I do for you, sir?
Well, listen, I bought 400 there today.
Okay.
All right, now fucking half of these things are busted.
Okay.
All right, now I'm very angry here.
What color you got, sir?
They were like a brownish color.
Which brownish color? You have a name on it? Yeah.
That's tan. It's like a tan, sandalwood, whatever the fuck you guys call it.
What's the name, sir?
Well, here's the problem, Jerky. Half of them are broken. You understand? And I got a job to do.
Sir, we could talk somewhere,
Don't give me the somewhat shit. It's always a problem with you guys.
Who am I speaking to?
This is Frank. Frank Rizzo.
Huh?
Frank Rizzo! Open your fucking ears, jackass.